Evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us here today. On behalf of the Advocata Institute, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this launch of our report addressing a key area of Sri Lanka's reforms as we make the case for privatization of state-owned businesses. I would especially like to thank all parliamentarians and policymakers from the key political parties who have accepted our invitation and have joined us here. It is a well-established fact that state-owned enterprises have contributed greatly towards Sri Lanka's current economic crisis by absorbing land, labor, and resources that would otherwise be used in a more efficient manner. The reform of state-owned enterprises has been a core project of the Advocata Institute since its inception in 2016, and we have always worked to bring public awareness to state-owned enterprises and how they impact the economy. In these interesting times, with elections just around the corner, having this conversation seems more important than ever. Now that we all know why we're here, please join me in welcoming Ms. Rehana Thowfeek, research consultant with the Advocata Institute and the main contributor to the report that is being launched today, as she sets the tone for the rest of the evening. Over to you, Rehana.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rehana, and I was one of the main contributors to this year's version of Advocata's flagship report. So before we continue, there's a very basic but very interesting question. What exactly is a state-owned enterprise? Now, Sri Lanka's approach to state-owned enterprises has been somewhat confusing, because we have a very broad definition of what a state-owned enterprise is, and that often also encompasses certain public services like universities, regulatory agencies, hospitals. So because of that, the conversation on when we say reforming state-owned enterprises often tends to get pulled in multiple directions. So firstly, we need to clearly separate out the state entities that have kind of a very clear profit and commercial motive from those that provide public services. So in this year's report, Advocata's state-owned enterprise report, we make a very clear distinction and focus our efforts on state-owned enterprises which operate with a very clear commercial and business objective. And we refer to these as state-owned businesses. And the state-owned enterprise restructuring unit actually refers to them as public commercial businesses. So in this year's edition of Advocata's flagship report on SOEs, we focus on privatization. Now, why should we privatize these state-owned enterprises? Well, firstly, they are a massive drain on public resources. I think we are all very intimately aware about this problem. The debt owed by state-owned enterprises amount to about 6 trillion rupees in 2023. And that is roughly about 275,000 rupees of SOE debt for every Sri Lankan man, woman, and child. So these massive debt numbers are as a result of what we call soft budget constraints. And that is the willingness of the government to intervene and bail out loss-making state-owned enterprises. There are a lot of there are certain fiscal rules in place, for example, with the previous Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, but oftentimes these fiscal rules have been circumvented by the government, and as a result, that has led to a huge accumulation of losses and debts. Next, these state-owned enterprises are rife with corruption. Now, these are just a few snippets from the IMF's governance diagnostic assessment. So I'll just quote some of what has been said. Weak oversight of public investment by SOEs pose significant governance vulnerabilities. Corrupt practices in SOE procurement, corporate governance and transparency of SOEs are weak. Political intervention in day-to-day operations of SOEs. So state-owned enterprises are a major source of corruption vulnerabilities in Sri Lanka. I don't think there's anyone who can deny that. Thirdly, they distort markets. SOEs dominate key sectors like banking, energy, telecommunications, and oftentimes there's very little competition allowed into any of these sectors. Some of them are forced monopolies. The lack of competition means that they can very easily disregard the kind of discipline that markets enforce. We have price controls in place, so basically manipulating prices, which affect the profitability of a market, which also affects the way that private businesses can operate in the market. The government gives these SOEs subsidies, financial support, and the large footprint of the state in commercial activity oftentimes crowds out private sector, such as in terms of access to capital, in access to labor supply. And because of the dual role of the state as both the operator as well as the regulator, they often give preferential treatment to these state-owned enterprises. So the forced comforts enjoyed by these SOEs leads to an overall misallocation of resources in the economy. But at least, has the state's massive involvement in the economy led to an increase in consumer welfare? Well, not really. As you can see from these screenshots of some of the headlines that I have put on my presentation, I think we can all remember how we stayed in queues for fuels and gas because the state enterprise did not have the money to import and supply these to the people of Sri Lanka. People died waiting in queues. We had exploding gas cylinders because the state enterprise supplying gas, it received preferential treatment from the regulator on certain safety standards. The Sri Lanka, this is the one on disappearing bus routes was a new article, very new story. So basically the Sri Lanka Transport Board doesn't have the money to keep bus routes running. So people are losing access to essential services like buses. So, this massive state involvement has not really made the consumer better off either. Now, privatization is obviously one of those solutions that we can use, one of the options to consider to rescue Sri Lanka from the grips of these state-owned enterprises. But why do we propose privatization instead of any other methods? Well, it's pretty simple actually. Other methods have simply not worked in Sri Lanka. There have been previous attempts to infuse discipline into these state-owned enterprises through methods like corporatization, parliamentary oversight, but unfortunately these have not worked. And even things like changing management, changing supervision, financial restructuring, and even the global research indicates that these kinds of changes only lead to very modest and very slow progress. So the government is always willing to state good intentions, but you cannot often alienate a lot of the powerful vested interests that have formed around these state-owned enterprises. So the best option is to get the enterprise out of state hands. Now, one of the reasons that state enterprises fail to perform is because of what we call conflicting objectives. So while we, the consumer, want good quality products and services at a very reasonable price, the politicians and SOE managers, want to use the enterprise to fulfill their own needs, provide jobs to supporters, give themselves lucrative allowances. So these conflicting objectives often leads to the consumer being the one who pays the price. because they don't have any decision-making power in how these SOEs are operating. But with private ownership, we get rid of these conflicting objectives. The consumer wants a good quality product or service at a reasonable price, and the private enterprise wants to provide that good quality product or service at a reasonable price. Because if they don't, they'll simply have to shut down and leave. Private enterprise managers, they are accountable to the owners of the enterprise. And if they don't deliver, they will simply be replaced. So there is very little to almost no conflict of interest between the objectives of the ones who manage the enterprise and then the owners of the enterprise. Unlike state enterprises, which also get access to treasury guaranteed debt, allowing them to borrow from banks and financial institutions, despite having really bad financial performance, private enterprises don't have this luxury. They have to service debts on time. They have to show a good track record of repaying debt. Otherwise, they will not be able to access any finance or any lending. So private businesses are subject to the natural market-determined constraints on budgets and the discipline of commercial financial markets. Now, corruption is another major issue in SOEs, as we saw before. And I'm not saying that the private sector is not without corruption, but the costs of corruption in a private enterprise are borne by the owners, the employers, and the managers. So it is in their best interest to take swift action against it. Unlike in an SOE, in which the costs of the corruption are borne by the public. If someone steals from a state enterprise, and we have seen this before as well, in many cases, they get away with it scot-free. But if someone steals from a private enterprise, more often than not, they will be held accountable. I looked at the research when we were writing this paper, and one analysis which looked at 61 companies in 18 countries and 32 industries found that any form of privatization, whether partial or in full, led to very strong performance gains. So the post-privatization performance gains were in sales, return to assets. They are so significant. And almost all firms actually expanded their profit margins post-privatization. And the case is pretty similar in Sri Lanka as well. If we look at the return on assets, if we compare between private enterprises and state-owned enterprises, for example, in banks, the private banks have higher return on assets than the state-owned banks. Lanka IOC has a much higher return on assets than Ceylon Petroleum, and private hospitals perform better than some of the state-owned fee-levying hospitals as well. So one of the most significant benefits of privatization is that it will also greatly reduce the future fiscal burden that these SOEs could place on the government. Yes, now we see entities, they are charging cost-reflective prices, so they are able to make profits, but what is the guarantee that they will continue this policy of cost-reflective pricing? What is the guarantee that we will not go back to subsidizing utilities at massive losses? Some of the other benefits of privatization I've just listed here. Obviously, the proceeds of privatization will lead to some amount of revenues in the hands of the government, which is obviously a good thing, and we'll see increased private investment into the country, which will boost overall efficiency. So when we talk about privatization, there are often a few common criticisms about privatization, and the main concern is always about the sale of national assets. Why are we selling these national assets? So this concern is tied in part to the transparency of the privatization process, Will there be sort of foreign conspirators trying to take over these national assets? Now, we'll see later on, I'll talk a little bit about the current privatization process, and we can also talk more in detail in the panel discussion. But there are processes in place currently for the privatization which ensures a certain good degree of transparency. The second primary concern is the possibility of job losses. So obviously conventional wisdom would have us believe that private owners would want to sort of cut the fat. They would trim, they would get rid of workers in order to make profits. But the global the literature points in both directions. It's not, it doesn't say this or that. You find evidence of it going both ways. So for example, one analysis of performance post-privatization in 61 countries found that employment actually increased after privatization. While another study of about 6 countries found that privatization led to about a 10% job loss. And in the case of Sri Lanka's own experiences at telecom, privatization did not lead to any job losses. And in fact, in the case of Sri Lanka Telecom, it actually led to higher wages for the staff. In some Sri Lankan SOEs, I suppose we cannot avoid job losses because there are just so many, it's just so overstaffed. But obviously in such instances, the government can step in with generous severance packages, retraining programs to sort of, ease the transition. Now there are also certain other concerns about asset stripping and insider privatizations. But we'll talk more in detail about the process, but the current process has sort of addresses some of these concerns. For instance, the SOE restructuring unit has a very clearly defined rationale for state ownership. So in case of market failure, and in cases where people lose access to essential services, which is one concern that people have, there is space for the government to enter and provide that service if need be. So it's not a case of, some people will not have access to this service at all post-privatization. It's a case of, if there is a failure, the government can step in. So when talking about privatizations, there have been both successes and failures. And there are several lessons that we can learn from these. The privatization of Sri Lankan buses, for example, is a failed case. But why did it fail? Let's look a little deeper into it. So from 1907 to 1957, the bus services in Sri Lanka were privately run. But because of inefficiencies and poor service delivery, it was nationalized in 1958. But by 1978, there was massive overcrowding and a lot of service problems. So this pushed the government once again to allow private sectors to operate in the bus service in 1979. Now this led to a huge boom in private bus companies, but also resulted in very intense competition and overcrowding, with a lot of small operators lacking kind of the professionalism and safety standards that you should expect. But why did this happen? Why did the privatization fail? Well, for one, the state was still intervening in setting prices. So it ran there were few CTB buses, and they would set kind of low fares. So obviously, to compete with these CTB fares, the private operators had no choice but to, charge maybe slightly above this rate. So this led to very cutthroat and destructive competition. So the private bus operators would overcrowd the buses and drive very hazardously to try to make a profit on that route. Now, the large private bus companies who had previously sort of had their hands burnt in the 1950s nationalization, they didn't want to take part in this new privatization that happened 20 years later. So it was mainly small private bus operators who came up during this wave of privatization. So because they were such small players, they didn't really have the capacity to expand their services. They couldn't buy more, they couldn't expand their fleet. They couldn't invest in professionalizing their service delivery. They just didn't have, the economies of scale or the efficiency or the ability to invest in making their services better. Additionally, the transport regulator, the National Transport Commission, was also extremely ineffective in sort of enforcing the safety and service standards. So because of this, it's an interesting case because the bus transport sector, both nationalization has also failed and privatization has also failed. Now, the British Railways is another example which is often discussed when we're talking about privatization failures. But again, why did it fail? Firstly, they used a franchisee model. So the private sector would bid based on certain parameters, and the state would award the contract to the highest bidder. Now, because of that mode, this kind of led to the private sector having, sort of over-promising and under-delivering, which obviously was, which led to a lot of friction. And despite this liberalization of railways in the UK, the government's involvement in rail services did not really reduce. And in fact, the government would essentially dictate everything the franchisees could do. So when they could operate, when they must, which trains to operate, which facilities to lease, which station to go to, what time to go to that station, what's the maximum fare they could levy, how long they can operate. So there was no freedom for the private players to decide how best to optimize their profitability. So it was a classic case of over-regulation. The government was telling the private sector exactly, the path that they should go on, even though that's not the optimum path. So the lessons that Sri Lanka can learn from these experiences is that we obviously need an independent and aggressive regulator, but the regulator must also be pro-market. They must, follow sort of a laissez-faire approach. The government must also be careful not to over-regulate, like in the case of British Railways. Yes, regulation is important, but you mustn't over-regulate to such an extent that you restrict the operations of the private sector. Obviously, there should not be any political intervention in the operations of these enterprises, and the private sector must have the freedom to decide how best to optimize their profits. So I'll just end my presentation by saying that ultimately, privatization of these state-owned enterprises is not just an economic necessity for Sri Lanka, but it's actually a political imperative. It is a crucial step towards dismantling this system of political patronage that has so far sort of determined policy in Sri Lanka's democracy. It has ended up enriching a few people at the cost of many. So a transparent and competitive privatization will reduce the opportunities available for these types of corruption and will force politicians to focus on policies and performance rather than patronage. This approach, coupled with a solid regulatory reforms and a strong judiciary, will be the way forward for a more efficient market and economy in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you, Rehana. If you wish to view the full report, please scan the QR code that is being displayed on the screen. It will lead you to the Advocata website where you will find the full report in English, Sinhala and Tamil. Moving on, I would now like to invite Mr. Dhananath Fernando, Chief Executive Officer of the Advocata Institute, for a brief context setting in Sinhala.
බොහොම ස්තුතියි මේ ආරාධනා පත්‍රය අපි යවුවට පස්සේ මේ ප්‍රයිවටයිසේෂන් ගැන කතා කරනවා කියලා මට කිහිප දෙනෙක්ම කෝල් කරා. කෝල් කරලා ඇහුවා මොනවද අනේවා මේ කතා කරන්නේ ඔයාලට පිස්සුද? මේ ඡන්දයකට නාම යෝජනා කැඳවලා තියෙනවා. ජනාධිපතිවරණයක් එනවා සැප්තැම්බර් මාස 21. ඔයාලට මේ පුද්ගලිකාංශය ගැන කතා කරන්න ඔයාලට පිස්සුද? මොනවද මේ කරන්නේ? කියලා දුරකථන ඇමතුම් කිහිපයක්ම ආවා. ඉතින් මම මේ හැමෝටම දීපු උත්තරේ තමයි ඒකම තමයි අපි මේක කතා කරන්න ඕන. මොකද අපි ඇවිල්ලා ආර්ථිකය පිළිබඳ පර්යේෂණ කරන ආයතනයක්. අපි දේශපාලන පක්ෂයක් නෙවෙයි. දේශපාලන පක්ෂ වලට මේ කාලේ මේක ටිකක් අර තහනම් වචනයක් මේ ගැන කතා කරන්න සුදුසු නෑ. නමුත් අපි මේ ගැන කතා කරන්න ඕනේ මේ රජයට අයිති ව්‍යාපාර ප්‍රතිසංවිධානය ගැන අපි 2016 තමයි පළවෙනි වාර්තාව ඉදිරිපත් කරේ. මේ අවස්ථාවේදී ඊට පස්සේ අපි ඒකේ මේ මුලින්ම රජයට ඇති ව්‍යාපාර ලබන පාඩු ගැන සාකච්ඡා කරා. දෙවැනි අවස්ථාවේදී අපි ඒකේ තියෙන දූෂණය සහ වංචාව අවම කරන්නේ කොහොමද කියලා කතා කරා. තුන්වෙනි අවස්ථාවේදී අපි ඒක මොන වගේ ස්ට්‍රක්චර් එකක් අනුවද මේක නැත්නම් මොන වගේ ක්‍රමෝපායක් අනුවද මේක ප්‍රතිව්‍යුහගතකරණය කරන්න ඕනේ කියලා කතා කරා. සහ වෙනත් රටවල් වල තියෙන ටැමසෙක් මොඩල් එක, කසානා මොඩල් එක, හෝල්ඩින් කම්පැනි එකක් යටතේ මේක කරන්නේ කොහොමද කියලා කතා කරා. මෙවර කතා අපි කරන්න බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන්නේ පුද්ගලිකාංශයට මේක බාර දෙන්න යද්දි මොන විදියටද කරන්න කියලා. මොකද ලංකාවේ ප්‍රසිද්ධ දෙයක් තියෙනවා. ඒ තමයි සමහර වෙලාවට ධනවත් වෙන බොහෝ දෙනා ධනවත් වෙන්නේ එක්කෝ වටිනාකමක් නැති දෙයක් සහ ගානකට රජයට විකුණලා. එන තුට්ටු දෙකක් වටින්නේ නැති දෙයක් හෙන ගහනකට ආණ්ඩුවට විකුණනවා. එහෙම නැත්නම් හෙන ගහන්න වටින දෙයක් ආණ්ඩුවෙන් තුට්ටු දෙකට ගන්නවා. ඔය ක්‍රම දෙක තමයි ඇත්තටම ලංකාවේ ධනවත් වීමේ මඟ කියලා පොතක් ලියනවා නම් ඒ පොතට ගැලවෙනම ක්‍රම දෙක තමයි ඔය දෙක. නමුත් අපි ඇත්තටම අද කතා කරන්නේ මේ ඇයි මේක වෙන්න ඕන කියලා. මම ඉත්තා ඉක්මනින් රෙහානා දීපු ඉංග්‍රීසි ඉදිරිපත් කිරීම ඉතා ඉක්මනින් සිංහලෙන් මේක සාරාංශයක් දෙන්න කැමති අපි මාධ්‍ය හිතවතුන්ට. මොකද මේක සිංහල භාෂාවෙන් තමයි ඉස්සරහට යන්න ඕන නිසා. ඇයි අපි හිතන්නේ පුද්ගලිකාංශය ව්‍යාපාර කිරීම සුදුසුයි රජයේ ව්‍යාපාර කරනවට වඩා කියන එකට ප්‍රධාන හේතු තුනක් තියෙනවා. එකක් තමයි මේ ණය ප්‍රශ්නේ. අපි ගත්තට පස්සේ ලංකාවේ රජයට අයිති ව්‍යාපාරවල ණය එන්නම වැඩි වෙලා තියෙනවා. 2023 වෙද්දි මේක ට්‍රිලියන 6ක් බවට පත් වෙලා තියෙනවා. මේක සාමාන්‍යයෙන් සංසන්දනය කරගන්න අවශ්‍ය නම් ට්‍රිලියන 6ක් කියන්නේ කොච්චරක්ද කියලා ලංකාවේ 2023 අවුරුද්දේ ලංකාවේ ආණ්ඩුව සමස්තයක් විදියටම එකතු කරගත්තු බදු ගෙවන ජනතාවගෙන් එකතු කරගත්තු ආදායමත් ට්‍රිලියන 3යි. එතකොට දැන් ඒක ඇවිල්ලා ට්‍රිලියන 6ක් වෙලා තියෙනවා ණය ප්‍රමාණය විතරක්. ඒ නිකම්ම ණය තියෙන්නෙත් නැහැ. ණයට අපි පොලියත් ගෙවන්න ඕනේ. එතකොට අපේ පොලිය විතරක් යනවා අවුරුද්දකට ගෙවන්න ට්‍රිලියන 2.5. ආදායම ට්‍රිලියන 3යි. පොලිය විතරක් ගෙවනවා ට්‍රිලියන 2.5ක්. ණය ටික තියෙනවා අනිත් පැත්තෙන් ට්‍රිලියන 6ක්. ඉතින් මේක කවදාවත් සමවර කරන්න පුළුවන් සමීකරණයක් නෙමෙයි. ඒක අංක 1. අංක 2 තමයි රජයට අයිති ව්‍යාපාර කියලා කියන්නේ මම නිතරම කියලා තියෙන දෙයක්. අපි මේවා ඇවිල්ලා දූෂණය සඳහා හදලා තියෙන අපි කියන්නේ මේ ආයතන. එහෙම නැතුව මේ රජයට කිසි දෙයක් කරන්න අවශ්‍යතාවය නෙවෙයි දූෂණය සඳහා. මේ ගැන මම එක උදාහරණයක් විතරක් කියන්නම්. මේ පිළිබඳව අධිකරණ තීන්දුවක් තියෙනවා. ශ්‍රී ලංකන් ගුවන් සමාගමේ සිදුවෙච්ච ගුවන් යානා වංචාව පිළිබඳව. එතකොට මේ වංචාව ඇත්තටම අපි හැමෝම දන්නවා ඒවට පත්කිරීම කරන්නේ කොහොමද කියලා. ඒ පත්කිරීමුත් එක්ක ඒ පත්කිරීම කරන්නේ මේ ඉතින් මොන හරි දූෂණයක් බලාගෙන. එතකොට දැන් ඒකෙන් ඩොලර් මිලියන ගාණක පාඩුවක් වුණා කියලා අනාවරණය වෙලා තියෙනවා. හැබැයි මේ පාඩුව නෙවෙයි ඒ පාඩුව සිදු කිරීම සඳහා තවත් පාඩු ගණනාවක්ම අපි අරගෙන තියෙනවා. ඒ වගේ මේ සිදුවෙච්ච පාඩුව පියවන්න අපි ණයට ගත්තු සල්ලි වලට අමුතුවෙන් පොලියකුත් ගෙවන්න වෙනවා. එතකොට මේක ඇවිල්ලා ගහෙන් වැටිච්ච මිනිහට ගොනත් තැනලා පයින්ුත් ගහලා උස්සලා පොලෙත් ගහුවා වගේ වැඩක් තමයි දැන් වෙලා තියෙන්නේ. ඉතින් ඒක නිසා දෙවනි හේතුව කවුරු හරි හිතනවා නම් දූෂණය අඩු කරන්න ඕන කියලා. දූෂණයයි රජයට අයිති ව්‍යාපාරය කියලා කියන්නේ දෙකක් නෙවෙයි එකක්. ඒ දෙකම එකට යන්නේ. මොකද ඒක සාමාන්‍යයෙන් වෙන්නේ අපි දන්නවා ව්‍යාපාරයක් කරනවා නම් අපි රුපියල් 10ක් දැම්මොත් එහෙම අපි කොහොම හරි බලන්න මේ රුපියල් 10 උපරිම ප්‍රයෝජනය ගන්න. සාමාන්‍යයෙන් අපි කියනවා යාචකයෙක්ට රුපියල් 2ක් දුන්නත් අපි බලන්නේ තවතිසා දිව්‍ය ලෝකෙට එන රුපියල් 2කින්. ඒ කියන්නේ රුපියල් 2ක් දීලත් බලන්නේ උපරිම බෙනිෆිට් එක ගන්න. ඉතින් ඒ වගේ කවුරු හරි හිතනවා නම් මේ රජය මේක කරයි කියලා එහෙම වෙන්නේ. නමුත් පුද්ගලික අංශයට දුන්නොත් එහෙම උන්ට වැඩි නැමියාවක් තියෙනවා මේ වැඩිපුර ප්‍රතිලාභයක් ලබා ගන්න. අවසාන එක තමයි මේ රජයට අයිති ව්‍යාපාර කියලා කියන්නේ ඒ වගේම මාකට් එක ඩිස්ටෝට් කරනවා. නැත්නම් වෙළඳපොළ සම්පූර්ණයෙන්ම කරදර කරනවා. ඒ කියන්නේ වෙළඳපොළ ක්‍රමය නැති කරනවා. මොකද ගොඩක් වෙලාවට රජයේ ව්‍යාපාර කරන්න ගත්තට පස්සේ ඒක පාඩු ලැබුවට පස්සේ ඒගොල්ලෝ ඇවිල්ලා මිල පාලනයක් දානවා. එහෙම නැත්නම් ඒගොල්ලෝ ඇවිල්ලා රජයට විතරක් විශේෂ වරප්‍රසාද දෙන එක උදාහරණයක් තමයි රජයේම ඉන්න සුපර් මාකට් චේන් එක. නැත්නම් අපි කියනවා මේ සිල්ලර් බඩු විකුණන වෙළඳපොළ කියනවා. එතකොට සමහර භාණ්ඩ ඒ රජයේ ආයතනව ඒ කියන්නේ ඒ වෙළඳ ජාලයට යද්දි වැට් එක ගහන්නේ. හැබැයි අනිත් පුද්ගලික ආයතනයටදී වැට් එක ගහනවා. එතකොට ඉතින් අර මනුස්සයාට විකුණ ගන්න හම්බ වෙන්නේ නැහැ. මේකත් එක්ක මෙතන වෙනසක් වෙනවා. ඉතින් ඔය ප්‍රධාන හේතු ටික නිසා තමයි අපි කියන්නේ මේ පුද්ගලික අංශයට මේක කරන්න ඕන කියලා. හැබැයි අපේ වාර්තාවේ අපි පැහැදිලිව කියලා දෙනවා පුද්ගලික අංශයට දීපු දේවල් අසාර්ථක වෙලක් තියෙනවා. මේක ඇවිල්ලා මේ කෝකටත් අයිල වගේ ඕන එකක් කරන්න පුළුවන් දෙයක් නෙමෙයි. අසාර්ථක වෙච්ච අවස්ථා තියෙනවා. හැබැයි අසාර්ථක වීමේදී ගොඩක් දෙනෙක් පටලව ගන්න දෙයක් තමයි මේක මේ රජය සහ පුද්ගලික අංශය අතර තියෙන ෆයිට් එකක් කියලා. මේක ඇවිල්ලා රජය සහ පුද්ගලික අංශයත් එක්ක තියෙන ෆයිට් එකක් නෙමෙයි. මේක සහ වෙළඳපොළ ක්‍රමය අතර තියෙන තරගයක්. මොකද වෙළඳපොළ ක්‍රමය આવොත් තමයි අපිට මේක සමබර කරගන්න පුළුවන්. දැන් එක උදාහරණයක් තමයි ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ බස් රථ සම්බන්ධයෙන් විශාල සාකච්ඡාවක් තියෙනවා. මේ බස් රථ නැත්නම් අපි දන්නවා අපේ පොදු ප්‍රවාහනය පුද්ගලික අංශයට ලබා දීමත් එක්ක ප්‍රශ්න ගොඩක් ඇති වුණා කියලා. ඉතින් ප්‍රධානම හේතුවක් තමයි වෙළඳපොළ ක්‍රමයක් ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙන්නේ නැති එක. මම හිතන්නේ කවුරු හරි බස් එකකට ගිහිල්ලා රියදුරු මහත්තයාගෙන් හරි බස් එකේ අයිති මහත්තයාගෙන් හරි ඇහුවොත් එහෙම බස් එකද වටින්නේ රූට් පර්මිට් එකද වටින්නේ කියලා රූට් පර්මිට් එක වටිනවා බස් එකට වඩා. එතකොට රූට් පර්මිට් එක බස් එකට වඩා වටුනට පස්සේ හැමෝම බලන්නේ රූට් පර්මිට් එක ආරක්ෂා කරගන්න. මොකද අපි මේක ඕවර් රෙගියුලේට් කරන්න ගිහිල්ලා තියෙනවා. අපි බ්‍රිතාන්‍යයේ මේ වගේම පොදු ප්‍රවාහනය සම්බන්ධයෙන් සාකච්ඡාවක් ඇතිලා තියෙනවා. ඒකෙදිත් ওই වගේම ප්‍රශ්න තියෙනවා. ඉතින් අපි මේකට යෝජනා කරන ප්‍රධාන විසඳුම තමයි අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම දූෂණය අවම කරන්න. මේක එක ස්ට්‍රක්චර් එකකට ගන්න ඕනේ. මේක හෝල්ඩින් කම්පැනි එකක් යටතට ගන්න ඕනේ. මේ හැම එකක්ම පුද්ගලීකරණය කරන්නත් බෑ. ඒකත් අපි අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම පිළිගන්නවා. සමහර ඒවා රජය සමහර රජයයි සහ පුද්ගලික අංශ එකතු වෙලා කරන්න ඕන දේවල් තියෙනවා. සමහර ඒවා නියාමනය හරහා යම්කිසි කළමනාකරණයක් කරන්න ඕන දේවලුත් තියෙනවා. හැබැයි ඕවර් රෙගියුලේට් කරන්නත් බෑ. නියාමනය ප්‍රමාණයට වඩා කරන්නත් බෑ. එහෙම කරත් අපිට ප්‍රශ්නයක් වෙනවා. ඉතින් මේ වාර්තාව හැමෝටම අපේ වෙබ් අඩවිය ඔස්සේ බලා ගන්න පුළුවන්. මේ වාර්තාව විතරක් නෙමෙයි soy.lk කියන වෙබ් අඩවියට ගියොත් එහෙම ටැමසෙක් මොඩල් එක කොහොමද වැඩ කරන්නේ? කසානා මොඩල් එක කොහොමද වැඩ කරන්නේ? ඒකට කට්ටිය පත් කරන්නේ කොහොමද? ලෝකෙ මේ පිළිබඳව සාර්ථක වෙච්ච දේවල් මොනවද කියලා විශාල සාකච්ඡාවක් තියෙනවා. අවසාන වශයෙන් කියන්න තියෙන්නේ රජයට ඇති ව්‍යාපාර සහ දූෂණය කියන්නේ දෙකක් නෙවෙයි එකක්. ඒ වගේම ව්‍යවසායකයෝ හදන්නයි රජයට බිස්නස් කරන්නයි දෙකක් කරන්නත් බෑ. මොකද රජය බිස්නස් කරනවා කියලා කියන්නෙම ව්‍යවසායකයෙක්ට පයින් ගහනවා කියන එක. මොකද දෙන්නම එකම දේ කරන්න ගත්තොත් එහෙම මේ වැඩේ කරගන්න හම්බ වෙන්නේ නැති නිසා අපිට මේ වැඩේ කරගන්න හම්බ වෙන්නේ නැහැ. මම ඉතාමත්ම ස්තුතිවන්ත වෙනවා අපේ සාකච්ඡාවට සම්බන්ධ වෙච්ච හැමෝටම. මම හිතන්නේ අපිට හොඳ කීනෝට් එකක් තියෙනවා මේ ගැන අහන්න සහ ඔබට තියෙන ප්‍රශ්නත් ඉදිරිපත් කරන්න පුළුවන්. මේ පුද්ගලික අපිට මහේන්ද්‍ර ජයසේකර මහත්තයා ඉන්නවා රජයට අයිති ව්‍යාපාරයක් පුද්ගලික අංශයට ඇවිල්ලා ඒක කළමනාකරණය කිරීම පිළිබඳව අධ්‍යක්ීම් තියෙන ඒ වගේම ආසියානු සංවර්ධන බැංකුවේ කන්ට්‍රි අපේ ශ්‍රී ලංකා නියෝජිතයා ඉන්නවා මේ පිළිබඳව සාකච්ඡා කරන්න ලෝකේ අනිත් රටවල් වල මේ දේ සිදු වුණේ කොහොමද කියලා. ඒ වගේම සුරේෂ් ෂා මහත්මයා ඉන්නවා මේ රජයට ඇති ව්‍යාපාර ප්‍රතිසංවිධානය කිරීමේ ඒකකය මෙහෙයවන මහත්මයා. එතකොට අපිට ප්‍රශ්න සහ මේ පිළිබඳව සාධනීය සාකච්ඡාවක් කරන්න පුළුවන් හැම පැත්තෙම මේක ඉස්සරහට අරන් යන්න ඕනේ කොහොමද කියලා. මේක ඡන්දේ කාලෙම කරන එක තමයි මම හිතන්නේ වැදගත්. මොකද තාම ප්‍රතිපත්ති ප්‍රකාශවලට සමහර කරුණු ඉදිරිපත් වෙන්න තියෙනවා. ඉතින් ඒ නිසා අපි ස්වාධීන කිසිම දේශපාලන පක්ෂයක් එක්ක ගනුදෙනු කියන්නේ දේශපාලන පක්ෂත් එක්ක අපි වැඩ කරනවා තොරතුරු ලබා දීම සඳහා. නමුත් ස්වාධීන ආර්ථික පරීක්ෂණ ආයතනයක් විදිහට අපි හිතුවා ඡන්දේ කාලෙදිත් මේක කතා කරන්න අවශ්‍යයි කියලා. මොකද මේක රටේ ආර්ථික ප්‍රශ්නේ ප්‍රධාන කොටසක් නිසා. ඒකන බය වෙලා පැත්ත ගහලා අපි කියන සයිඩ් ගහලා ඉන්නවට වඩා මේක අවශ්‍යම වෙලාවේ කතා කිරීම තමයි ස්වාධීන ආයතනයක් විදිහට අපි යුතුයකම කියන එක තමයි අපේ අදහස. ආපු හැමෝටම ස්තුතිවන්ත වෙනවා. අපි වැඩසටහනේ ඉතුරු කොටසට යන්න මම රුවන්කට ආරාධනා කරනවා. බොහොම ස්තුතියි.
Thank you, Dhanana. Having served as a Commissioner of the Securities and Exchange Commission of Sri Lanka and as a member of the Monetary Policy Consultative Committee of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, our keynote speaker is a familiar name and face to many of us in the room. Though he currently sits as an independent, non-executive director on a number of listed and unlisted private sector entities, he is perhaps most well known for heading the SOE restructuring unit of the government of Sri Lanka. Please welcome Mr. Suresh Shah, Director General of the SOE restructuring unit and our keynote speaker for the day. Over to you, Mr. Shah.
Thank you, Advocata, and good evening, everyone. The case for privatization is pretty compelling, but before I get there, let me first speak about the pushbacks that we get when we speak about privatization. And fundamentally, there are three. The first pushback is why privatize profit-making entities? Now, I know Rehana made a case that SOEs are making a loss, but frankly, profits and loss are not the rationalization for privatization or otherwise of state-owned enterprises. Frankly, profit and loss is irrelevant. And let me tell you why. Firstly, because any loss-making enterprise can be turned into a profit. You know, you put someone like Mahendra as the CEO, and within a very short, or even Mangala, who is in the audience, both CEOs of companies, you put either one of them in any loss-making enterprise, and within a very short period of time, they'll turn it into a profit. At the same time, any profit-making enterprise can also be turned into a loss-making enterprise pretty quickly. So, you know, the story about profits and losses is irrelevant. And usually when people speak about these why privatize profit-making enterprise, the fundamental is that the government is going to lose a level of revenue by selling off these profit-making enterprises. Now, frankly, this is not the case because the government has a very unique mechanism to raise all the revenue that it needs. And only governments have this mechanism, and it's called the taxation system. And like all of us know, government can impose a tax on absolutely anything. They impose taxes on companies' revenue, which is called VAT. They impose an income tax on a company's profit. They impose a tax on whatever salaries we earn. When you import something, there is a tax. When you export something, there is a tax. And taxes are even imposed on people who have died. You know, there is a thing called a death duty, right? And there is also something called the inheritance tax. So you can impose tax. Government has the power to impose a tax on absolutely anything it wants. And not only that, it can adjust the rates of taxation as and when it wants. And we've experienced that as well. So you would remember at one time, VAT was 15%, it went down to 8, now it's back up to 18, and all in a very short period of time. So when government wants revenue, it doesn't need to run business. All it has to do is make the taxation system more efficient, more effective. They can raise all the money that they need. So this loss-making, profit-making rationale for keeping or privatizing state-owned enterprises really doesn't apply. So that's number one pushback. The number two pushback has been, these are all national assets. It's much nicer when they say it in singular. This is Jatika Sampath. And quite frankly, I look at these commercial enterprises and I ask myself whether any commercial enterprises, forget who owns it, whether any commercial enterprises can be categorized as a national asset. And I guess it all depends on the definition. And for me, the definition of a national asset is something that you can use to transform the country. And when I mean transform, I mean genuinely transform. So currently, if our per capita GDP income is $3,500, can any one of these enterprises make it $10,000? It's not possible. Now, why do I raise this point? Because we speak of these enterprises as the national assets and we put resources into those, but we miss the true national assets that this country has and we don't invest behind them. So let me give you a few examples of what the true national assets of this country are. Number one is our younger generation. Our younger generation, if we teach them the true values, if we give them the right education, they can transform this country. But do we invest behind our younger generation? Is our education system, does it get the necessary resources? It doesn't. But Sri Lankan Airlines gets the resources it needs. If it's running at a loss, government doesn't hesitate to pump money into Sri Lankan Airlines. But do we put the same amount of money that the education system needs? We don't. Think about our irrigation system. You know, our irrigation system takes rainwater and distributes it to the last acre of a farmer's land. This is a unique system. It's a tremendous asset that we have. How much money, how much resources have we put behind our irrigation system? If we invest in our irrigation system, just imagine the transformation it can do to the agriculture sector of this country. And through that, just imagine the transformation we can make for the country itself. But we don't invest behind our irrigation system. Take our maritime boundary. You know, our maritime resources are 3 times our land mass. What's the investment we have done into our maritime sector? Nothing. Imagine if we invest in that maritime sector, if we put our resources into the maritime sector. Imagine the transformation that we can do for this country. So the point I'm making is that we have ignored the true national assets because we have run after these commercial enterprises. We are missing the wood for the trees, unfortunately. The third pushback that we have got is that there are national security considerations in some of these state-owned enterprises. Particularly, the point is made on Sri Lanka Telecom. And then I asked the question, where exactly is this national security threat? And believe me, to date, no one has been able to pinpoint and say, here is where the national security threat is. So somebody just came up with the slogan, and everyone's simply following it. So these are the 3 main pushbacks that we have got. Profitable SOEs, to me, it's irrelevant. These are national assets. They are not, because they are not transformative forces. And 3, national security, and I really don't see where the national security threat is. I'm more than happy to listen to anyone who can point out and say that here lies the national security threat when it comes to a particular enterprise or any one of these SOEs. So what's the case then for privatization? I think Rehana and Dhananath in their presentations made a very compelling point, some very compelling points. But let me move away from the numbers and speak on some of the fundamentals. The first fundamental is that when you think of the responsibilities of a government, ask yourself what those responsibilities are. And let me tell you a few. Firstly, a government is responsible for national security. Secondly, a government is responsible for foreign relations. Thirdly, a government is responsible for economic development. Fourthly, for education, healthcare. Where does it speak about running commercial businesses? It doesn't. So why do we want government to look at something so insignificant as running a commercial business when it's got all these much bigger issues to deal with? Think about it. National security, compare it with running a commercial business. It's insignificant. Think about foreign relations and running a commercial business. It's insignificant. Think about economic development and running a commercial business. It's insignificant. Why do you want to put a responsibility to government of such insignificance when government has to deal with far more greater issues? Let government focus on those big issues and let these commercial enterprises be run by somebody else. So this is the first fundamental reason why privatization needs to take place. The second reason is that government has to look after the interests of citizens. And how does it do that? It does it through legislation, it does it through regulation, and a couple of other things as well. But when the regulator, when the person who forms the regulations, who forms the legislation, is also running a commercial business, how do you know that the regulation is for your benefit or for the benefit of that company? How do you know this? And let me give you an example. In 2014, there was the Insurance Act that was passed by Parliament. I think it was 2014. That act very specifically said that an insurance company cannot run life insurance and general insurance under the same legal entity. This was a law of the country. And every single private sector insurance firm had to split it up. There was one firm that did not, and that was Sri Lanka Insurance Corporation. It did not. For 10 years, it ran as a single legal entity, when the law of the country said that it cannot. So these are the kinds of advantages that these SOEs have got. And whose interest did the Insurance Act try to protect? Your interest as citizens. But this SOE just simply ignored the law. The politicians allowed SLIC to ignore the law, and they happily continued until 2024, when it was finally split up, because we wanted it split up before privatization went through. So there is, when the same person is the regulator and an operator of the business, there is a massive conflict of interest. And this is the second most compelling reason why you need to privatize state-owned enterprises. Rehana and Dhananath identified many other reasons like the corruption and so on and so forth, and all that is true, but I will just leave only these two. Having said that, there are also instances where government has a responsibility, and I use the word responsibility, to get involved in commercial businesses. There are instances, and those instances fundamentally relate to market failures. What do I mean by market failures? It is the responsibility of government to ensure that citizens have access to essential goods and services. The term essential is very important. It's essential goods and services. Now, in the event the private sector, for whatever reason, is incapable or not willing to supply those essential products and services to the citizens of the country under a competitive environment, then the government has a responsibility to intervene. And that responsibility may be fulfilled through running a commercial enterprise. There are other methodologies it can use, for example, legislation, regulation, and so on and so forth. But if all of those fail or are not possible for whatever reason, then the government has a responsibility to get involved in the supply of that essential product and or service. There are two other considerations. One is if there is a development need, and again the private sector for whatever reason is not willing to take part, then the government may have a responsibility. And of course, thirdly, a national security issue. But like I said earlier, in the Sri Lankan context, I have yet to see any SOE which has a bearing on national security. So under these circumstances, there is a case for the government to get involved. Now, in the event government does get involved, then it needs to manage these enterprises in a way that it doesn't become a burden on the fiscal. So that's the other side that we have looked at. You know, when we speak about state-owned enterprise restructuring, when I mean we, I mean the country, everyone thinks about privatization. But there is another very important, possibly even a more important side of the reforms that we have looked at, and that is to see how these enterprises that remain under government control can be managed without being a burden on the fiscal. So we've created a state-owned enterprise policy which has been approved by the cabinet. We are putting the policy into a law. A draft of a law has been done, which clearly lays out how you take political interference out of board appointments, for example, how do you treat subsidies? And I'll come to subsidies in a minute. I'll explain how the subsidies have really caused a problem in this country. What disclosure requirements are necessary, what kind of board members should be appointed, and so on and so forth. It's based around 9 principles. It's available on the web for anyone who wants to take a look, so it's a public document. So whilst the privatization program has been ongoing, there has been parallel work that has been done to say how these enterprises, if they remain under state control, how they should be managed. Now, let me, in a kind of wind-up, let me explain to you how the SOE sector has really caused a tremendous amount of damage to Sri Lanka in the way that they have been run, and I'll do this through an example. So it gives you an idea of what has happened and what we need to prevent going forward. All of us benefited from subsidized fuel until, I think, late 2022. We were very happy. Petrol may have, or diesel or whatever it was, may have cost 200 rupees. We must have got it for 150. As a result of which, the CPC in their accounts showed massive losses. Now, CPC is also the sole supplier of jet fuel in the country. And in order possibly to recover some of those losses, what the CPC did, because it was a monopoly, is that it charged a relatively high premium on all the jet fuel it supplied to all the aircraft that flew in and out of Sri Lanka. When I say high premium, high in comparison to the region. Everyone charges a premium, obviously, but this is higher than the regional the jet fuel cost. Now, 30% of Sri Lankan Airlines operating expenditure is jet fuel. So because they were charged a higher price on jet fuel, their losses also went up. So now you had 2 enterprises. One was CPC and one was Sri Lankan Airlines, both showing massive losses. And they were both reflected in their accounts. Now, with losses of this nature, companies can't operate. They need funds. They need a source of funds. So they go to government, who is the shareholder. The government doesn't have the money to give them. So what does government do? Government gives them what's called a treasury guarantee. And they take this treasury guarantee and go to the state banks. And the state banks give them the money based on the treasury guarantee. Now, this money doesn't get paid back. Of course, they may have been settling the interest, but the capital doesn't get paid back. Now, that's okay. But ask yourself, where does the money come for the state banks? Where does the money come to the state banks? From the shareholder? That's only a very small component. The money to the state banks is your money. It's your current accounts, it's your savings accounts, and it's your fixed deposits. So the money that you put into the state banks was going to fund these loss-making enterprises. And this puts the entire financial system at risk. So whilst you and I enjoyed subsidized fuel, we put the entire financial system at risk by doing this. So one of the reasons, one of the points that we addressed in our SOE policy and also in the draft law is, yes, government wants to give a subsidy. They have every right to do that. You know, election season, everyone's speaking of giving everyone sahana. That's okay. Let whoever wins, let them come and keep their promises. But you give a subsidy, do not park it in an enterprise. Do not park it in a SOE. Please take it back into your expenditure, into your budget, into the government's budget. So that's there in the SOE policy, that's there in the SOE law. Give a subsidy, that's fine. Don't park it in the enterprise, take it back into government expenditure. So that's how the SOE sector has been managed, and that is exactly what we need to unravel. And that's what we need to do. And that's why privatization helps, and that's why managing the remaining enterprises that remain within government is also so essential. And so let me wind up with just something that I have invented as I have gone along in this particular job. You know, when you eat fish, you don't go out and catch the fish that you eat, right? You have many different ways in which you can get the fish that you want to eat. And similarly, when it comes to government, to achieve its objectives, it does not need to run a commercial business. It has many ways in which it can bend the private sector to its will. It has the power to regulate, it has the power to legislate, it has the power to tax, it has the power to incentivize. So it can use a multiple set of tools to bend the private sector to its will for the benefit of the citizens. And that is what government needs to do, not to get involved in running a state-owned enterprise. The objective is to provide the citizens with essential goods and services at a decent price, at a good quality, and at reasonable availability, convenient availability. And it has many tools through which it can do that. It does not need to actually own and run a commercial business. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason why government should not be involved in a business. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shah. We will now move on to our panel discussion for the evening. Let me now introduce our panelists for the day. Having been appointed as the Asian Development Bank's Country Director for Sri Lanka in July 2023, our first panelist this evening, Mr. Takafumi Kadono, boasts over 23 years of professional experience, including more than 11 years at ADB and 5 years at the World Bank. My apologies. Prior to this, he spent many years as a consultant responsible for energy, urban, water, and reconstruction projects across Asia and Latin America. Welcome, Mr. Kadono. Our second panelist, Mr. Mahendra Jayasekera, is the Managing Director of Sri Lanka Wall Tiles PLC, Lanka Tiles PLC, Swistech Ceylon PLC, and Lanka Ceramic PLC. He is also the Chairman of CMA Sri Lanka, Cost and Management Accounting Standards Board. Welcome, Mr. Jayasekera. Rounding off this panel for the evening is none other than Mr. Suresh Shah. Welcome back, Mr. Shah. And finally, our moderator for this evening will be Ms. Rehana Thowfeek. The panel will be followed by a short Q&A session, but if you do have any burning questions that cannot wait, you may share them with us by scanning the QR code that will be displayed on the screen. Over to you, Rehana.
Thank you, Ronka. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So, we've heard a lot about privatization and the case for privatization, so there's no need really for an introduction. So let's just go straight into the panel questions. And let's begin this panel with a question directed to Mr. Kadono. Given your extensive experience in power and electricity reforms in countries like Vietnam and Laos, what advice do you have for Sri Lanka as it attempts to reform the country's electricity and power sector?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Advocata, for having me here on the stage. Well, I guess the second thing I want to say is I want to commend the government for the enactment of the Electricity Act, which sets the foundation for this power sector reform that is being undertaken in this country. I did work in various countries, but I guess we need to be clear about what the objective of this reform is, right? I mean, in the case of other SOEs as well, but in these strategic SOEs in particular, is it the poor services? Is it the lack of investment? Is it the tariff is too low? Is it overstaffing, like you said? So or the lack of transparency? So like in the case of Vietnam, I think the issue was that they wanted more transparency as well as attract private investment, particularly in the generation subsector. So they have started this reform back in 2004, so it's been 20 years now. It's a long journey, but they have been able to attract some private sector investment. But I think the profitability of the sector is not there because the retail tariff at the end is regulated and it's not at cost recovery levels. The Philippines had a more drastic approach. In 2001, they had they unbundled the National Power Corporation, and there was a privatization of the generation companies, the generation assets, and then a long-term contract awarded from the transmission. And the objective there was they wanted to address the debt issue that the National Power Corporation had. And by selling these assets, they were able to use the proceeds to pay off the debts. They were also able to improve the service quality too in the meantime. However, now they still have the challenge that the retail tariff in this case is a little bit higher than the region average. Outside the region, like Kenya, they had a partial privatization. So they listed, I think, 40% or so of the utility share in the Nairobi Stock Exchange, and they were able to bring in the private sector. Here, this was the issue they wanted to address was lack of investment as well as access to capital. So there are different ways of doing it, like Mongolia and other countries have also gone through the process. So I think in this case, for CEB, I think there's, of course, the lack of transparency and the high cost of generation, for example, maybe the overstaffing. I think these are the areas that need to be addressed. So the short answer is to be clear about what the objectives you want to reach at the end of the day are, have a plan. It's going to be a long journey, but keep the political will there, because without it, we will not be able to reach that final intended objective.
Thank you. Mr. Jayasekera, you took over at Lanka Tiles almost a couple of, I think, quite soon after it was privatized. So in your experience, how did Lanka Tiles perform after you took over? And what kind of restructuring did you have to do? Did you have to do any restructuring? How was that planned out? Did you all have to close any unprofitable lines? If you could just tell us a bit about your experience.
Yeah, Rehana, actually it was not Lanka Tiles that was privatized. It was Lanka Ceramic that was privatized. Lanka Tiles, Lanka Wall Tiles, they were subsidiaries of Lanka Ceramic. And Lanka Ceramic privatization was somewhere in 1995. And what the government did at that time was to split the ceramic corporation, Ceylon Ceramic Corporation, into two. And one part was privatized under Lanka Ceramic. But actually, in my opinion, Lanka Ceramic privatization, that particular company, the holding company privatization, I think actually later on when I look back, what I feel is it was meant to fail. Because years of inefficiency, no investments in the factories. And also the government did not have a roadmap for the company after privatization. Because the government should have a roadmap for these privatizations. Otherwise, the companies fail. Now, particularly in the case of Lanka Ceramic, when I went in there, I realized that for about at least 20 years, no investments had taken place. And the government privatization was on the basis that there will be huge tariff protection for ceramic industry. And that is how the Ceramic Corporation made money at that time. And then soon after the privatization, the government started reducing tariff. and the company was not ready to absorb the competition that would come in the form of imports. So what we had to do was to shut down. And we shut down the factories. I think we made about 5,000 employees redundant. But then the government comes and tags it as a failure of privatization. I have heard politicians saying Lanka Ceramic closure was the result of privatization. It was not, because the government did not have the roadmap for privatization. It's the same thing that happened for the textile companies. Tulliriya textile mills, Mattegoda textile mills, Veyangoda textile mills. No roadmap. The government privatized, and overnight the government makes import zero tariff. And overnight the companies failed. Then, so like that, the privatization, government's privatization program actually in early 90s, in the case of Lanka Ceramic also, failed because there was no roadmap, there was no transparency in privatization. And now in cases like Oils and Fats Corporation, it's the same thing. Everywhere it's the same thing that happened. There was no clear roadmap for companies, and poor investors got caught.
When you say roadmap, could you give us an indication of what you mean?
No, what I mean is basically, see, the government knows whether these companies, these corporations can compete or not. Now, say for example, now when Lanka, say clearly, Lanka Ceramic privatization was through the stock exchange on an offer for sale document. There was hardly any time for investors to go and do proper due diligence, and the government, investors had to rely on the assurances given by the politicians. So then the investors go and invest, assuming that the government policy towards the industry will remain for some time, expecting the investors to make money, recover their investment. But then when the government policies change overnight about the industry, how can the companies compete? There was no roadmap. Now, say for example, textile privatization. There was no roadmap. The government did not have a clear policy as to how the textile sector would be developed, and how what kind of assistance these privatized corporations will be given in the initial years, because they have to come out of the legacy the government has left behind in these companies or corporations, in terms of inefficient labor, inefficient machinery, the methods, everything. And then these corporations had been protected through import tariff. So government has to take all these into consideration in privatizing public enterprises. Otherwise, what happens is, when people see these corporations or the enterprises failing, they think, okay, this is due to privatization. And the government takes that as an excuse not to privatize also. Say, here, this is the result of privatization. So we need to protect this. Then it becomes national asset, like Suresh said.
Thank you, Mr. Jayasekera. Mr. Shah, this wasn't my planned question for you, but based on what Mr. Jayasekera said, it just occurred to me. So Sri Lanka has had like multiple waves of privatization, and there have been certain botched attempts at privatization. So do you think it has had an impact on the current privatization process? Like, has it had an impact on sort of investor appetite, for example?
Yeah, the reality is that I think this is probably the 5th or 6th attempt at privatization. How much of an impact the past privatizations have had on this one, I'm really not sure. I mean, countries coming out of a very tough economic situation as well, so I'm sure that has played a part. But of course, the politics surrounding privatization, I think, has played a huge part as well. So, you have to get the state machinery involved in the process. And that state machinery is manned by people, and people are afraid, particularly with elections coming up and so on and so forth. So those have played, I think, probably a bigger part than the past examples of privatization. Of course, we were also very conscious. I mean, we were very conscious when we started the whole process, because, like Mahendra said, the connotations around privatization is that the process has been very corrupt, not transparent, not credible. So we wanted to address those issues, as a result of which I think we put some very tight systems and controls into place, and very different from how we would have done it whilst we were in the private sector. You know, we bought and sold companies in the private sector. We do things very differently. But because of this perception around privatization in the past, we were maybe a little extra cautious as well. And so that has had an impact also. But I think the country circumstances, and also I think not just the current circumstances, but I think the investment environment in the country itself over many, many years. And to give you an example of this, you know, Sri Lanka has never attracted $2 billion of FDI in any given year. Not in any single year have we attracted 2 billion in FDI. And that tells you a story, and that tells you that people look at the Sri Lankan investment environment, the operating environment with very negative terms. Okay? Very recently, I was addressing another conference at the Institute of Chartered Accountants, and I asked the question from the audience, and this was in terms of incentives. The question was, would you invest in a badly run, poorly regulated finance company that gives you 20% interest for your deposit? Or would you invest it in a well-run, well-regulated bank that gives you only 10%? And everyone in the audience said, we'll pick the bank. Although, you know, the interest rate was half. So that tells you that incentives don't drive investment. It's the operating environment. And Sri Lanka's operating environment over so many years has been quite poor, and I think that is also a contributory factor, particularly in terms of attracting foreign interest into some of these entities.
Thank you, Mr. Shah. And this is a question I'd like to put to all three of you. Given your interactions with people, you know, from a variety of backgrounds, what do you think the public appetite is for reforms of state-owned enterprises? I mean, during the height of the crisis, there was a certain zeal when people were standing in queues and, you know, people were dying, waiting for things like gas. I mean, there was a certain zeal then, but do you think it has lost steam? What is your perception or take on this?
Okay, so let me go first on this because I've had the experience on it, right? We expected a lot of pushback from the general public, a lot of pushback from the trade unions, and I must say we've not got any kind of pushback either from the general public and very little pushback from the trade unions, and that was also mainly in relation to one company. The real hesitancy that I have seen has been, and actually not even from the politicians, you know, it's not happened, but there has been a little bit of hesitancy in the public service, and I think that again relates more towards the elections coming up and all of that. And very, very interestingly, yesterday I was speaking at a university to the university students, and so I asked them two questions. How many of you think these are national assets, Jatika Sampat? No one put their hand up. And I asked them, how many of you think privatizing profit-making enterprises is a wrong thing? Nobody put their hand up, right? So I think that tells you a story. University kids, you know, and they are the most vociferous of the stakeholders, and they didn't seem to mind at all. So I think that tells you a story. And at the same time, maybe the economic crisis has also contributed in two ways. One is I think people know that, you know, we can't do what we have done in the past 75 years. We need to rethink, we need to move forward differently from a policy perspective, number one. And number two, they may also be too concerned about their daily needs and, you know, meeting, you know, getting food on their table to worry too much about state-owned enterprises and whether they are privatized or not.
Yes, actually, I also would agree with Suresh that right now there is no major opposition to public, SOE reforms, because I think people also are beginning to understand why reforms are necessary. Because Rehana, if you go back, I mean, first we have to understand, first we have to make people understand how these state-owned enterprises came into being. Now, I mean, most of these corporations were set up under this 1948 State Industrial Corporation Act. And that was a time when the private capital was scarce for big investments. So that is why the government had to step in to attract investments on government-to-government basis. Now, all these corporations like textile mills, ceramics, steel, maybe oils and fats, a lot of these tire, all these corporations were set up as government-to-government deals, and technical assistance came from the Russian Soviet bloc mainly. And actually, these corporations were meant to be privatized later on. The idea of the government was to set this up, make them profitable, and later on at some point of time to privatize these corporations and let the private sector run these corporations so that the government could recover the seed capital it had put in. But that thought lost on the politicians because they started making money out of this. So that is why there was stalling of that process. For many years they ran as government organizations, but due to this economic crisis and better education, and people are beginning to understand that the reforms are necessary. Without reforms, the country cannot move forward. Actually, I mean, what we are seeing is when we talk to people, although publicly they don't express their opposition, in their heart still the story of sentiment of, the government is trying to sell national assets. National assets is still very much there. Actually, it is very much present among clergy also, because they buy into that very strongly. And I think that happens because I think although Suresh says there is no pushback from the politicians, not on surface, but underneath politicians push back. Because they are the people they are the people who go and tell these other interested parties, look, these governments are trying to sell national assets, we should oppose them, and that they are the people who are sowing seeds of this. But overall, I would think by and large, there is, I mean, the opposition to reform process is diminishing. That's what I feel.
Thank you. Mr. Kadono, would you like to add anything?
I don't have too much to add, being a non-Sri Lankan. But, I mean, generally, we're talking about privatization and SOEs, but more generally, I think there is a support of the citizens towards reforms in general. And like you said, Suresh, people feel that something has to change. And of course, if you look at, like the IMF staff report, the reform of SOE is one of the key pillars, right? And then more broad-based structural reforms is also a key component of this. So I think there is an understanding that this has to be done, and the importance of SOE in the overall landscape of economic structural reform.
Thank you. Mr. Shah, in your keynote address, you spoke a bit about the role of the state and the importance of its role as a regulator. So I'd like to ask, sort of from all of you, how important is this role of the government as a regulator? Has it been an effective regulator so far? What is the advice that you have for the government on this front? We can start with Mr. Kadono.
So ultimately, the government's responsibility should be to regulate, right? So I think that's where they should be. And I think you have answered most of this in your presentation as well. But the independence of the regulator is very important. With respect to the privatization, of course, the role of the regulator prior to the privatization, like the valuation process, and then the process itself of the privatization, so that it does not become a corrupt process, right? And that's one of the concerns that the people may have. And then post-privatization, how that entity is being run, and then how by doing so, opening up the industry to attract more private sector investment, and especially the foreign direct investment as well. And just to note, I was very surprised when I came here that FDI here is only 0.7% of the GDP, which is tremendously low. So definitely the government has a huge role to play as a regular, well, not the government, but the regulatory authority who is independent from all types of interventions are very important.
Yeah. So because of the privatization process and the SOE reforms, it's something that we've looked at, but not too deeply because we were focusing on other areas. But having said that, I think it's absolutely critical that you have not just regulation, but you have the right regulations and that you have independent regulators. Because see, at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is on the one hand, you've got people who have invested money, the shareholders, who obviously want the highest return for their investment. But on the other hand, you have consumers and citizens of the country who want a fair deal. And when you leave it just to the two of those stakeholders, to only those two groups, usually the power is in the hand of the investor, not so much in the hands of the consumer. So you got to have someone who's protecting the consumer interest, the interest of the citizens. So you got to structure this right. You got to have independence of the regulator. In the Sri Lankan context, from what I have realized, we don't, our regulatory, the regulations that we have may not be really up to date. I think there are plenty of gaps in the regulations that we have, so those need to be spruced up. And I think the independence of the regulator also may not be to the level that is ideal. I don't think we are even close to the ideal. So we got a lot of work to do in both areas, the regulations themselves as well as the independence of the regulator. And I think this is something that we need to focus on and fix. But one of the things that has come up in this whole privatization program is that you don't have the right regulators, so therefore don't privatize. Now, I don't agree with that either. You don't wait until you perfect the regulatory system to do some of the stuff that you need to do both. And it doesn't matter which one you do first as long as both get done quickly. So you've got to focus and get both done.
Actually, Rehana, I need to make a small, I need to add something to my previous answer. Before I get to this, I said in my previous answer, it's the politicians who covertly oppose privatizations or reforms. But one thing we ignore is the corporate sector. Because in Sri Lanka, there are a lot of corporates that are making money out of the inefficient public sector. SOEs. I mean, that's a fact. Let it be telecom, ports and services, health, education, power and energy, petroleum. All these sectors are being favored. I mean, running like this is being favored by the corporates because they are making money out of it. And it's not only the politicians. Actually, politicians are pumped up by corporates, really. That you don't see. You don't see that. That is what practically happens. When it comes regulation also, what happens is with regulations comes discretion. With regulation comes discretion. Now, how do you regulate? When you appoint people as, okay, how do you make the regulator independent? Independent of whom? Because Sri Lanka is a very, very small, closed society, and everybody knows each other. They can be influenced. And these are the practical issues any government would face. Although people come and say, look, we'll run a transparent government, meritocracy and all that. Finally, it boils down to who are going to run these places, who are going to be put in charge of these places. I mean, you can draw a line to everybody, really. So it's a very difficult exercise, but regulation has to be proper. It has to be made independent as much as possible. And the regulators also should be given a clear goal, a clear aim. Otherwise they also go haphazardly. I mean, we can see it in, I mean, I can talk about, say, one instance. Now, say, for example, Securities and Exchange Commission regulation. Really. Lot of corporates don't agree with the type of regulation they are doing. So like that, they also should be given an aim. They also should be monitored really, how they are regulating, because sometimes you appoint people who have no experience in the industry, no experience in the private sector. They try to do what they think is best. And then the regulator also fails. That's why people are losing confidence in certain regulators also. So it has to be, I mean, it's a difficult thing, but it has to be addressed. So we have people like Suresh to address these things.
I had a question in here about how the private sector can benefit from privatization. But now, based on your response, that question no longer seems appropriate.
No, I mean, Rehana, no, I mean, seriously, you level the playing field. So if you take, for example, the insurance example that I gave you, right? Insurance corporation was breaking the law. And that was at a severe disadvantage to the others. And there are many such examples. So if you take, say, the ports, today the regulator of ports, the Ports Authority, is also operating a port in competition with other private sector ports, right? So for whom are the regulations made? So that's a big question mark. So you do level the playing field through the privatization process. It makes for a much more competitive environment. I mean, I don't think this happens now, but there was a time when government servants had to travel on Sri Lankan Airlines, right? That doesn't bring competition into the system. And without competition, the consumers don't benefit. So not just the private sector, but I think the additional competition also helps the consumer, helps the citizen, and levels the playing field. So clearly there is a case.
Definitely. Mr. Kadono, in your opinion, what are the biggest obstacles Sri Lanka faces in this whole drive for SOE reforms and privatization?
The biggest obstacle. Well, again, I mean, we cannot go through these reforms, the entire economic structural reforms, including SOE reforms, without that political will and that continuity. So that's for sure. But with respect to privatization, and I think Suresh, you also mentioned as well, but there are those SOEs that should be privatized, and there are those who may remain SOE, public commercial enterprise, with certain levels of government intervention or ownership. So like in the power sector, we're not talking about privatization, right? It's a power sector reform, unbundling process. Maybe there is some divestment in the future. Of course, like let's just take the power sector. So like in the generation, like I said, one of the objectives is to bring down the cost of generation. And for that, we want to attract investment, private investment into renewable energy, right? So that's where the private sector can come in as a result of this unbundling. Maybe in the future, if the distribution companies are unbundled, maybe that is an area where private sector want to invest. So by going through these reforms and not necessarily privatization per se, we will be able to make the industry much more vibrant and more competitive and bring in that necessary investment from the outside or from domestic investors as well.
And do you feel that political will is there for the long term?
For the long term? Oh, you're asking the wrong person.
Okay, so I'll take that question because it's not fair to ask Taka on that question. No, the real issue is political will. And not just in terms of SOE reforms, but I think for reforms in general. I've been saying this now for a while and I'll say it again. There is no economy. There is what's called a political economy, right? And every action on the political front has a repercussion on the economics, and every action on the economic front has a repercussion on the politics. So you have to compromise between two contesting forces. the politics and the economics. The successful countries of this world, and I think Singapore is a fantastic example of this, when that conflict happens, those countries that have compromised on the side of economics have progressed and have developed. And every country that has compromised on the side of politics has not gone in that same successful path. And if you look at almost all the countries in the South Asian region have compromised, unfortunately, on the side of politics, and Sri Lanka is a very, very good example of this. So the day we decide to compromise on the side of economics, things will change. You asked the question about the long term. I don't know the long term, but I can certainly tell you about the short term. I don't see that on the horizon, unfortunately.
This is a question for both Mr. Jayasekera and Mr. Shah. Given your private sector experience, how do you think the current privatization plans will benefit the private sector as well as the consumer?
So like I told you earlier, I mean, it's basically opening up the field for greater competition, leveling the playing field. And through this process, by creating greater competition within sectors, the consumers end up benefiting, because when you compete and when you compete well, and if properly regulated as well, right, prices become better, quality becomes better, accessibility becomes better. So at the end of the day, you do, the consumer, the citizen does and must benefit. So I think that's the ultimate aim, that's the ultimate goal. It's not about selling something and then, you know, getting some money and paying some debt off. I think if we approach it in that way, you're taking an extremely short-term approach. That's not the way to do it. So when, in, say, example, Sri Lanka Telecom, it's not just about divesting Sri Lanka Telecom, but it's also looking at the regulatory environment surrounding the telco sector, which we did as part of the sell-side due diligence. We got experts in to look at the regulatory system. We identified the gaps. We've made recommendations to the TRCSL saying, here are some of the things that you need to change. We've, in fact, worked with the TRCSL and all the industry players to get some things changed as well during this short period. So you got to approach it with this 360-degree approach. So it's just not selling some shares off. You don't approach it that way. You approach it from the perspective of consumer interest and citizens' interest.
And also, Rehana, what happens is now, say for example, through the reform process, the privatization. Now, okay, before I get there, what happens now, what is happening in this country is, what we have to understand is, large part of our economy is being dominated by the government. Now, if you look at ports and aviation, water, gas, electricity, petroleum, education, health, they are all dominated by the government, which is inefficient. So if we, through reforms and privatizations, if we make this large sector of the economy more competitive, that will attract a lot of other investments. Economy will grow. Economy will grow much faster, because why the economy is not growing is that the government intervention in the economy is too much. Government intervention means too much control. Now, say for example, I can give you example for this. Once I was, watching television. Schumacher had just won a Grand Prix, and he was interviewed, and interviewer asked him, "What is the secret of winning?" He said, "I would like to feel when I drive. I would like to feel I am not in control of the vehicle. Then only I feel I am going fast enough." Same thing for companies. If I am in full control of the company is not growing, that means. If the government is in full control, that means the economy is not growing. Economy cannot grow. We are not taking risks. So, through the reform process, what you do is, you allow the sector, the whole economy, ready the whole economy to take risks. And that risk-taking appetite, when you create, investments will come. The economy will grow. So that is the benefit of privatization. Although I said corporates are opposing privatization, that is because they take a fairly short-term view within their comfort zone. They are comfortable. They are making money comfortable. But they don't see how much more money they can make if the economy is liberalized.
I think now we'll start taking some questions from the audience. I see some questions coming in. There's a question on why are the SOE reforms slow, and can we see the bill of SOE regulations?
I'm sure you wrote that question. Well, so yeah, I mean, like I told you earlier, if we were buying or selling something in the private sector, it would have been a lot quicker than this. But we had competing objectives here. I mean, one was to get the job done, yes, but then also get it done in a way that was transparent, that was credible, because we were very conscious about the perspectives around privatization in the past. Okay, and we were extremely conscious of the 3 privatizations that were reversed through fundamental rights applications. We simply didn't want that to happen going forward, not because of anything, but because it would have damaged the investment environment in the country, tremendously damaged it, particularly if the investor who bought it was a foreign investor, and then that transaction got reversed. I mean, that would have really damaged the Sri Lanka's economic environment. So we were very conscious of that, and because of these things, we put certain controls, procedures and controls in place to ensure the transparency, ensure the credibility of the whole process. And as a result of that, yes, it has taken time. It could be a lot quicker if we were not concerned about those aspects. But then, of course, then people would have wondered whether deals were made and so on and so forth. So, so you had to kind of figure out a balance between these competing forces. And that was the reason why not. Having said that, I think we need to relook at a couple of things, the way they have been done, to speed the process up. I have a few things in my mind. So let's see what happens going forward.
There's a question from the audience. Yes, yeah, you're getting a mic.
Right. Thanks for the opportunity. My name is Lasintha, just an independent consultant. And I was just wondering with the conversation, what were we trying to conquer? All the discussion is about conquering the local market. But is that what the country needs? Take China or Singapore. What are they conquering? They are conquering the world. China is the manufacturer to the world. Singapore is the trading hub to the world. What are we doing in that line? If we achieve that, all what is spoken are irrelevant, because we need the dollars. I mean, the per capita income to be higher. Now, Singapore, like GDP can be, say, 400 billion, but the trading takes place about in multiple trillions, right? So if we do that, I think the country will prosper. So some areas like, say, enforcement of law is the worst in Sri Lanka, I would say. So those are more critical than all these reforms what we are talking. So even energy reforms, we must see how competitive are we, our industries, our services, our products in the world market. So in order to do that, that can be one of the prime objectives to do the reforms. So in that way, what are you conquering? Is it the world or just the within the country industries?
Can I answer?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, Rachinta, right? Rachinta. No, actually, you are quite right. I would like to put it this way, or look at it this way. When you say SOE, how do you define SOE? State-owned enterprise. For me, state-owned enterprise is any government intervention in the country or the economy. If it is not achieving its purpose, it has to be reformed. Any government intervention. It could be judiciary. It could be police, right? It could be the armed forces. It could be anything else, education, health, or whatever. If it is not achieving the purpose for which it has been set up, it has to be reformed. It's a state-owned enterprise. That is how I look at it. So, conquering the world market, if you don't reform these SOEs, in that sense, we cannot conquer world markets. Now, say for example, 2019, USA imposed anti-dumping duties on 2,000 Chinese products going to USA. Did Sri Lanka identify 20 products and encourage investors to set up here to export to USA? No. Why? Because the government institutions, we are talking about these commercial enterprises. How about EDB? reform. Ministry of Trade and Commerce, Department of Commerce, they all have to be reformed because they are not achieving the purpose for which they have been set up. That is why this is not happening. So people think that is the exact opposition people have for this reform process, because people think this is all about selling national assets. That is how we have coined it. When we talk about reforms, we should talk about state reforms, including all these institutions. If the police is not delivering the purpose, achieving the purpose for which it has not been set up, it is clearly not achieving the purpose, it has to be reformed. So that is also part of his job. He can't be only talking about telecom privatization, Sri Lankan privatization or CEB privatization. That is not only his job. He has to look at those also. Because if we do not reform those areas, these privatizations will fail, as I said in my initial remarks. I hope I gave some kind of answer to your question.
Yes and no.
Yeah.
If you have an outside-in approach, if you don't have an outside-in approach, nothing happens. That's a biggest document. It can be the constitution.
Yeah, sure.
The constitution is all.
That has to be reformed.
Exactly. That is the biggest document we have reformed.
Exactly.
Of the nation, not of a political party.
That's what I mean.
I think that is beyond the scope of today's discussion and a much larger one.
Suresh can't reform that.
There's a question.
Yeah,
Yes.
actually, I'm Ranulf. I'm actually a member of Advocata. So my question is actually to Mr. Suresh. So, Mr. Suresh, if you take a case study of, government companies or SOEs in East Asia, you actually find the government does play kind of a big role in most of these SOEs, okay, in East Asia. If you take, for example, Vietnam Telecom, Vitel, is largely government owned, and it has ROEs, return of equity, of close to about 30-40%. While here, even a partially, privatized SLT is only, ROEs of about 10%. So my question is, why do you think East Asia is so good at running, these SOEs, while the government does hold, a large share in these companies?
You're right in terms of certain countries do things in a particular way. But just because somebody does it in a particular way, I don't think we need to do it that way. And you got to ask yourself whether government needs to be in business or not. And if the answer is government needs to be in business, so be it, then be in business. But if the answer is government does not need to be in business, then don't be in it just because Vietnam or Singapore or Malaysia does it. We got to figure out this for ourselves, right? And to me, it's a very simple, it's a very simple question. Do we want to put money for business class seats on Sri Lankan Airlines, or do we want to put money into hospital beds? Where do we want to put not just the money, where do we want to put our resources? And find the answer to that and then act according to that. Don't worry about what somebody else does. You don't think about what your neighbor does and, live the way your neighbor does, right? I mean, it's very simple. It's just like that. Do what you think is right.
Right, thank you.
There's a question that has come through Slido. If one reason for privatization failure is not having roadmaps for privatization, how and when does the evaluation or anticipation process should take place? I'm not sure if that question is clear, Mr. Jayasekera. I think this is for you, because you spoke about...
Read that again?
Can whoever asked it please clarify what you meant? This is on the roadmaps for privatization.
Yeah, sorry, yes.
What it was said was like a failure took place because we didn't have plans for the future when we are privatizing it.
In certain cases.
Yeah. So then in that case, when should we start it and how we should start this mapping process? Because even government should have some control even after privatization. You should have some control. So how does we match that
Yeah, now actually, say for example, remember in late 90s when plantations were privatized, there was plantation restructuring unit. They really mapped out, how the plantations will be carved out, segregated from, carved out really into different companies, and how exactly the government would monitor and what exactly the concessions given for how long. There was a clear roadmap for that. But of course, there were lots of pitfalls in that privatization, because if you remember, when certain individual or when certain companies started bidding, nobody else bid. And they could buy those companies for a song, really. There was no floor price, nothing really. But now, say for example, in the case of, say, textiles, right, even ceramics, maybe oils and fats, the government, before privatizing those institutions, the government should have had a proper plan for privatization, proper plan and a roadmap for the industry, future for the industry. Whether the government is going to protect it or promote it, what concessions will be given, how the government will attract more investments into the sector, whether forward, backward integration will be facilitated. That kind of planning should take place before privatizing. If you just go and privatize and the government changes mind, then the investors are left high and dry. So that is what I meant really. That is what happened in those privatizations.
I have a question.
Sorry? No, it has to be done. Actually, the government has to initiate that. No. Now, like the government set up this plantation restructuring unit, there should be like what Suresh is doing now. Now, before you just privatize corporations, there must be proper planning as to what the investors are going to be offered. That has to take place really. Like you now say, for example, when you sell a company, what does the management do? They package that company for sale. So there should be packaging of the SOE for sale, a proper sale. That's what I meant.
Can I just respond as well?
Yes.
So, fundamentally what you're doing is you're taking an enterprise which is not necessarily the most efficient, not necessarily the most competitive, and then you're giving it to a new investor. A new investor, whoever it may be and however smart they may be and however resourceful they may be, they can't make the change within a short period of time. It takes a particular amount of time to get these enterprises from where they are to a position where they become really competitive, where they become really efficient and effective. So you need a little bit of space. The investors need a little bit of space to turn these companies around. And I think that's probably the roadmap that Mahendra is talking about. Government needs to understand that there is a period that you got to allow the new investor to take this company over, to re-strategize, to bring in the right operational systems, processes, to make these companies more efficient and so on and so forth. So you got to understand that you can't make very fast changes very quickly after a privatization program is done. That, I think, is what the story is all about.
And the
Yes,
need
we have
for
a question here.
predictability, right? Yeah.
Mike.
කියවුණා නියාමනය කරන ආයතනයත් රජයෙන් තියෙද්දී ක්‍රියාකරන ආයතනයකුත් රජයෙන් තියුණාම ඒක හරියට නියාමනය කෙරෙන්නේ නැහැ කියලා. මේ නියාමනය කරන ආයතනය විදුලි සංදේශ නියාමන කොමිසම සහ ක්‍රියාකරන ආයතනය මොබිටෙල් එක තියෙද්දී රාජ්‍ය සේවය පිණිසයි උපහාර පැකේජය නියාමනය කළා ඒක නැවැත්තුවා මේ ටෙලිකොමියුනිකේෂන් මේ විදුලි සංදේශ නියාමන කොමිසමෙන්. ඒ කියන්නේ කරන්න පුළුවන්. පෞද්ගලීකරණය ගැන හොඳද නරකද කියන එක නම් අපි හැමදාම අත්විඳිනවා පොදු ප්‍රවාහන සේවයේදී. එපමණයි ස්වාමී. බොහොම ස්තුතියි.
ප්‍රශ්නයක් තිබ්බද නැත්නම්? කමෙන්ට් එක අහන්න. Okay. I think there was a question here. No, you can go ahead.
This question of, I have a question about privatized companies failing. I mean, not failing, they are going out of business. So if private companies go out of business, even privatized companies, shouldn't they go out of business if they are badly managed? And as you say, if there's a government policy change, government's policies change. Liberalization you have to expect. I mean, I remember, I think, Pugoda Textiles. Lakshmi Textiles was managing it. They got it for 10 rupees a share at a very low price. And they had like a clear run for about 6 years, I think, when they until the tariff protection was taken off. And until that time, there were, the cloth prices were very high. It was smelling of like all kinds of, quality was not good. And there's massive fraud taking place in the imported garments because of the protection given for Pugoda, Tultex and Vatex. And because, for example, they failed, I think Vatex failed and the land went to, I think, Bank of Ceylon or something. And now MS Fabric Park is there. So isn't that the way it's supposed to work? I mean, government should, if it was the government will have to take over and pay for the VRS and so on. So world changes, policies change, liberalization has to happen because consumers can't pay protection money for like a long time. So, and if it fails, then somebody else has to take over. And some of the people who took over some of the businesses, also invested a lot of money. I think Ceylon Oxygen, some foreign investors, they had to do, when they took over, they completely changed the entire system because it was so inefficient and taking so much electricity. And they completely did a lot of investment. So my problem is, why do you call this a failure? That is the way private business is supposed to work. They are supposed to fail if they are not managed, if they enjoy protection. So if they fail without a cost to the taxpayer.
If you can respond to that.
Yeah, sure. No, actually, I never said that the privatized enterprises should not fail, Lasantha. They should fail really if they are not competitive, definitely. What I meant was, when these privatized enterprises fail, people say they failed because of privatization. That is what I meant. Otherwise, the companies cannot operate. They obviously should go out of business. What I meant was, when these companies fail, people say it failed because it was privatized. It is not the case, really. So that is what I meant. And
excuse me. Yeah. No, I just want to make a small point.
And also one more thing. One more thing in this whole thing, the government should really identify what industries we can compete in. What are the industries the government should promote? We have to have a clear idea. Now, say for example, I am in ceramic industry. I can speak for ceramic industry. Ceramic industry is not an industry for Sri Lanka. It cannot compete. So ceramic industry is not a industry that, okay, government call it a thrust industry also at some point of time. But it cannot be a thrust industry because we don't have the resource base to make it a vibrant industry. And the industry can survive only if there is certain amount of protection. And in a lot of countries, governments do protect industries. Now, say for example, USA has only maybe maximum 6 to 7 tile factories. But when those tile factories go and lobby the government, they slap anti-dumping duties on China. Thereafter, India took over replaced China as the biggest exporter to USA. Then what did they do? Again, the companies went and said, look, India is dumping products, put anti-dumping duties. They started anti-dumping duties investigation on Indian products. So America protects only 6-7 tile factories they have. So, all countries protect their industries to a certain extent. It has to be there. You can't have, this free trade policy is a non-existent policy. Nowhere does that kind of a thing exist really. So there is a lot of misconception about this.
Yeah, no, I just one more. No, it's
I
not.
think we can have the conversation later. I think.
Sorry.
we are almost at the end of this panel discussion, and I think there's been quite interesting and sometimes opposing views also, like for example on free trade and whether some industries have to be protected. So a very big thank you to our 3 panelists. As well as the audience for engaging with us. And I think we can ask any other burning questions we have later on when we're enjoying some refreshments. So I hope we all leave this session with sort of a better understanding of privatization and what it means for Sri Lanka in the current context. So I'd like to give it back to Ruanka. Thank you.
Thank you, Rehana, and thank you to our distinguished speakers for an interesting and engaging discussion. As always, thank you to our audience for supporting us in our journey to bring about sound policy reform in Sri Lanka, and we'd be happy to hear your feedback on thoughts on both the discussion and the event. Thank you again for joining us and engaging with us, and I hope you have a lovely evening. We look forward to your presence at future events as well. Thank you.